Well, welcome everyone. So excited to have you here with us today at our back to school webinar, Civic Education Secures Democracy. It's a great topic and we're excited to get to our discussion with our panelists. I'm Michelle Vesey, Executive Director of New Hampshire Businesses for Social Responsibility, a 22-year-old membership nonprofit dedicated to convening, supporting, and inspiring businesses and their community stakeholders to build a more prosperous and sustainable state for all our residents. NHBSR and Business for America are really pleased to present this webinar today on the urgent need for civics education. Our panelists today will discuss the business case for civics education, the state of it in New Hampshire, local efforts to improve and increase civics education, and the importance to the community and to our businesses. NHBSR as an organization has worked with Business for America in a variety of projects, including the Vote Safe initiative, where we provided companies access to information that would support full participation in the 2020 election, fulfilling our employees' civic duties and that of their families in the midst of the pandemic. So when BFA shared the Civics Secures Democracy Act letter of support, I didn't hesitate to add NHBSR to the prominent list of signatories, knowing how important civics is to our work. Our organization over the last year has constantly been working on how we can bring people together where we're experiencing so much division, even within our workplaces on a variety of topics, and just finding it hard to find common ground. And so I knew that so much of that was really based in the fact that we've let go of civics education. And so I think this is a fantastic opportunity for us and our schools, and it was certainly something that NHBSR wanted to support wholeheartedly. So we're really glad to be a part of that letter, and we hope that all of you will speak to it as well. And Richard's going to give us a little bit more information about it in just a moment. First of all, I just wanted to briefly introduce our speakers. I'm really looking forward to what they have to say. It's a deep and incredible group of experts, and I want to thank Zena for pulling this group of people together along with the webinar. She's really going to she's really lined up a great group for sharing information on this important topic with us. So to maximize our time, I'm going to provide a highlight of their bios, but Zena has posted a link where you can view their full biographies that demonstrates their extensive background and passion for civics education. Our moderator today is Richard Eidlin, who's the National Policy Director for Business for America, a business membership nonprofit working to mobilize the private sector at the federal and state level to support voting rights, election security, depolarization, and a healthy representative democracy. He has worked at the intersection of business, public policy, and sustainability for over 30 years, and I have run into him in various capacities over all of those years, I think. And I want to welcome Steve Dupre, who's the president and CEO of Foxfire Property Management Company and the Dupre Companies in Concord. I found it interesting, he was elected to the New Hampshire General Court, the state's legislative body, in 1972 at the age of 19. And he has continued to civically engage as the former national committeeman for the Republican Party of New Hampshire, the Republican congressional candidate, and the advisor to the 2008 Republican presidential nominee, John McCain. I'm also excited to have Courtney Tanner, who is the Director of Government Relations for Dartmouth Hitchcock and works on improving access to necessary health care and supportive services for various populations. She works with both the executive and legislative arenas in the New Hampshire state government. Currently, she's working with a diverse and skilled board to establish a residential treatment program for pregnant and parenting women seeking recovery from substance use disorders with their children. Families Flourish Northeast. I'm also excited to welcome Martha Madsen, who's the Executive Director of New Hampshire Civics. She has over 20 years of experience in public schools in Massachusetts and New Hampshire at the high school, middle school, and elementary school levels. as an English language arts teacher, a school counselor, and in the role of curriculum and instructional leadership roles. Civic learning and school climate are her passions, and she has the highest respect for teachers. And finally, and last but not least, we have Carisa Corrow, the president and founder of Educating for Good. She was a public school teacher for 14 years, and she supported educators in the state and across the country with the Center for Collaborative Education, focused on designing competency-based assessment systems using the Quality Performance Assessment Framework. She's currently supporting Franklin High School as they create their portrait of the graduate. So you can see we've got a very deep and rich panel, so I am thrilled to have them with us here today and to really explore this topic of how we can use this opportunity to really build on our civics engagement in the state. So I'm going to turn it over to Richard.
Great, Michelle. Michelle, thanks so much, and welcome everyone. And real appreciation to Xenia, who helped pull all this together and was a great collaborator. It's a real joy to be with you all today. I used to live in New Hampshire, in Wilton, New Hampshire, and was a former board member of New Hampshire Business for Social Responsibility back in the 90s when I lived in the Granite State. So good to be with you all. Some quick background on Business for America. We are a national, nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization working to educate and then engage companies, large and small, in helping to strengthen our democracy. And our essential argument for why businesses should be involved is it's not only in their self-interest to have a stable political system, a government that functions well, but it's also in their communities within which they operate, those communities' interest. And what we have been noting is, particularly in the past decade, public faith, public trust in the workability of government, be it a Democratic or Republican administration in DC, public trust is dwindling. And The Economist found last year that, identified the United States as a flawed democracy and a faltering democracy, which means that increasing number of people, young and old, no longer really have faith in our political system. And while more people voted in 2020 than the previous election, it's still low compared to standards in other advanced industrial economies. So Business for America has been working with a large coalition to support a bill in Congress called the Civic Secures Democracy Act. And this is a great example of bipartisanship. And I want to tell you just a little bit about the legislation, and then we'll begin with our panelists and some questions for them. So this bill is co-sponsored in the U.S. Senate by Senator John Cornyn from Texas and Senator Chris Coons from Delaware, a Democrat. And if you're following politics these days, you know that Senator Cornyn and Senator Coons probably don't agree on a whole lot, but they both concluded that a lack of understanding by many Americans, particularly school-age kids, about how government works, that we have three branches of government, that we have a Bill of Rights, we have a Constitution, and as a citizen, you have certain rights and responsibilities, that all of that makes for a less stable society. So Senator Cornyn and Coons have gathered together some other co-sponsors, which include Jim Inhofe, Senator Cassidy, Senator King from Maine, Senator Kelly from Arizona, and a few others to push forward this idea that the United States should invest in civics education, just as it did in STEM. And so just by comparison, today, across the board, on average, we invest $54 per student in STEM education, which is absolutely essential. But by comparison, across the country, we're investing 5 cents per student in civics education. And we think that this is a real problem because again, from Business for America's perspective and many educators' perspective, a lack of familiarity with how government works, with the history of the United States, can make people more susceptible to mis and disinformation, maybe make them more conflict-oriented, make them more likely to get into an argument at work, and essentially not really have the facts and figures about how the United States political system works. As imperfect as it is, but it is working. So just a few elements about the bill that I'll mention. So it proposes a 5-year commitment, $1 billion per year, that those monies would go to state departments of education in the form of grants, and those funds would then be reallocated to local school districts. State Department of Eds can only keep 5% and have to pass on 95% of those monies to local school districts. And this applies to public schools K-12 across the United States. There's also some money that would be allocated to nonprofit organizations that do teacher training, that partner with school districts, and additional dollars would go to institutions of higher education. There's also some money allocated within that $1 billion per year for researchers who are studying civics education, and then a separate pot of money for focusing on historically disadvantaged or minority communities. And last point about the legislation, which I find really interesting, is first of all, there is no national curriculum. So one of the arguments that's made against this bill is that somehow it would impose some dictate from Washington, D.C., and every school district would have to teach the same thing. That is not correct. And if you read the legislation, you find there is no national requirement. There's no national curriculum. But the legislation does want civics education to include a focus on civics knowledge, American history, civic skills, the ability to read and understand how a civic institution works. It would teach about free speech. It would teach about civic behavior, voting, jury duty, and it would also focus on American political thought. And finally, an understanding of constitutional democracies globally. So as business leaders, we encourage you all to think about the importance of this issue for your employees and for your communities. And we have a sign-on letter that will get you all a copy of. And with that letter is going to go to Congress. And with that, let me turn to Steve to begin our conversation. So Steve Duprey, Steve, yep, there you are on my screen. I see you. Good, Steve, thanks for joining us. And I'm wondering, as a person who's been involved in New Hampshire politics for a long time, and has run a number of successful businesses, why is the issue of civics education important to you?
Well, I think in New Hampshire, we have a special attention to it, given that we're a small population with the largest legislature in the country. We run most of our community by town meetings where we elect volunteers to be our select people, our executive branch. And if you don't know how democracy works and you don't know how to participate and you don't feel your voice is being heard, people give up. And when people give up, then and people don't pay attention, they become disengaged, they don't care what happens. And then frankly, that opens the door for people who may not have the best of motives and have a different direction they want to take our democracy in. So without being partisan partisan at all. If you want people to feel good about where they are in this life and feel like they have a say, the same say as the president or the richest or poorest person, they have to feel like they have a voice that's heard. And the only way you have a voice that's heard is if you know how democracy works, you know the importance of primary elections and things like that. And frankly, in the last 20 to 30 years, as other subjects have taken the forefront, the time that I grew up in, where civics was a year-long course in high school and you had to master it, has gone by the wayside. So a large percentage of folks who work for me, for example, don't have a full understanding of how they can make their voice heard. If you don't feel you're heard, you get frustrated, you drop out, and that leaves the decision to fewer people. That's not good for democracy. So I think it's important, because if we don't have a democracy that functions well, if we don't have everybody on the economic ladder participating, and people feel that democracy doesn't work for them, they're not going to care what happens. And then being a capitalist, I'd like them to care deeply, and like them to care and see that, notwithstanding its flaws, capitalism is the best economic system in the world. And if people don't participate, they're going to lose, they will forfeit participation, and then terrible things can happen, and governments run afoul.
And Steve, can you think of some examples over the past few years where this lack of understanding about civics has shown up in the workplace? You know, have you been involved in conversations?
Sure.
Yeah.
I have folks who will complain about an election or who holds office, and I always ask the first question: did you vote? No.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I said, if you don't vote, you forfeit the right to complain. I'm not very tolerant of folks who won't participate, and regardless of one's views on school budget, we just had a good example in a small town here in New Hampshire where a dedicated group of people thought the school budget was too high. They made sure they showed up. They cut the school budget precipitously in half, and the town was up in arms. A lot of people were up in arms afterwards and said, hey, that shouldn't have happened. Well, it happened because the people who said it shouldn't have happened didn't take the time to go to town meeting. And if you want to get good government comes from a hearty contest of ideas and everybody participating. And experience shows us as well that people are a lot more willing to tolerate the other side winning if they felt that they got a chance to participate. But what we're seeing too often in America is people coming up with an excuse for not participating, but then being unhappy with the results.
Right. And Steve, I think you said this is not partisan. I think another way to say that is this is about values, not politics. And yet we seem to live in an era right now where everything becomes political. So how do we, in the context of civics education, maybe move beyond that partisan rancor?
Well, I'm not sure we will, and if you read back when Jefferson was running for president, there was quite a bit of partisan rancor then, although it took a lot longer to get a broadsheet out than it does to hit send on a Facebook or social media post. But one great goal of good civics education, way back when I went to Kennett High School, we had to read newspapers from very different viewpoints. The dominant conservative newspaper in New Hampshire was and is the Union Leader. A far more liberal newspaper would be the Boston Globe, certainly. And we were required to learn how to read both. And I think one of the critical skills that our students aren't learning now is how to look beyond what you're fed on social media or in the news, whether it's the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or the Boston Globe, or the Concord Monitor, and think about fairly questioning viewpoints. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, pick the media source that seems to reinforce what they think about issues and then just listen to that. So I think one valuable lesson of civics education is you should always be questioning your own biases, and you should learn how to question them openly and fairly. Another value that we seem to have lost in this modern era is that compromise usually is the best result. And students aren't learning that they need to learn how to compromise. One of the great outcomes of World War II, I had a friend of mine who was an executive officer on a destroyer who went to Dartmouth, and his next in command was an avowed racist who never finished high school from Mississippi. They had to learn to get along. They had to learn to work together. And you saw all over the country when people came back, the select board in Conway would be a doctor, a lawyer, and a mechanic in town, because that blending had happened. Because we don't have civics discussions, because we don't have those kind of healthy debates, people are learning less about how to work together, and that too has infected our civic life.
Right. Steve, thanks. Let me bring Courtney in from Dartmouth Health to pick up on some of the ideas you've noted. Courtney, as the state's largest employer, you certainly have, you can have some impact around this issue of civics education, and I wonder why the company feels this is important, and what programs, if any, has Dartmouth instituted that help employees learn about government and politics, small p, that you have underway there?
Sure. Thanks so much, Richard. So the timing of your question is so great, because we are right now working on rolling out our We Care, We Vote initiative. We do believe at Dartmouth Health it's important to educate our employees on how to register to vote, where to register to vote, and to provide information to our employees about the candidates who are running for statewide office. We are the largest employer in New Hampshire, but we're also a nonprofit, and so we certainly do not engage in telling people how to vote, but how to vote, and so helping them get to the polls so they can vote and vote in an informed way. And so we roll out what we call health policy grand rounds, modeled after our clinical grand rounds, where we bring in candidates on both sides of the aisle, both sides of the ticket rather, who are running for a statewide office. Here in New Hampshire, it's going to be the U.S. Senate seat, our 2 House seats, of course, and the corner office, the governor's office. And we'll invite candidates on both sides of the ticket to come and talk about the issues that matter to them, and we'll ask them questions about their platforms. And we do that all before November 8th, which is the election day here in New Hampshire and in the nation. So that's one initiative that we have during the election year. We also last New Hampshire legislative session rolled out what we called the political determinants of health, and this is an ECHO series. And ECHOs are usually a clinical tool that a specialist can present different techniques or different treatment options for special populations. But we kind of took that model and we flipped it on its head, and we provided a non-clinical ECHO to individuals who cared about New Hampshire policy. Not as much politics as you pointed out, Richard, but policy that was being debated at the New Hampshire legislature. And we had a panel of experts who were navigating policy decisions in the New Hampshire legislature. So people from New Hampshire Hospital Association, New Hampshire Nurses Association, the Medical Society, and we brought them together to talk about policies that were marching forward in the New Hampshire legislature, and really start to talk about kind of both sides of the issue. So we talked about bills relative to COVID response, including vaccine mandates. We talked about bills relative to Medicaid expansion for special populations, including Medicaid coverage for postpartum populations. We talked about pediatric services, and of course, some of the issues that plague this group: childcare, housing, and what that means to the health of our state. And we're hoping to roll that out again next legislative session. And this is really an opportunity for our employees and for other people in our state to really roll up their sleeves and start thinking about these policies in a nonpartisan way, or I should say bipartisan way.
Okay. And Courtney, related to what Steve suggested about the more involved people are and the more knowledgeable, the more sort of empowered they are to participate. Have you found that these political determinants of health, there's some correlation between, a person's sense of well-being, I think maybe is the term used in the healthcare industry, and their likelihood of participating in the political process? Is there something you can suggest that where there's a linkage here?
Yeah, so I would say that, we know that the healthcare community for a long time has been talking about social determinants of health. We know that health outcomes are not driven just in a doctor's office or in a hospital setting, but they are really actually driven by access to resources that we have in our community, whether that's safe housing, access to transportation, access to childcare. And we know that when we have a healthy community, it's better for all of us, right? It's better for our employers, it's better for our employees as a group. We also know that many of these access to resources are driven by systems. We can't have a healthy community if we don't have developed systems. So transportation, education, housing, and childcare. But if we zoom out a little bit and we zoom out past the social determinants of health and start thinking about the political determinants of health, there are structural systematic structures that impact how we access these resources. For example, we know that IRS rules and regulations enable certain populations to reduce their tax burden or to keep their wealth. But in the same vein, we also know that laws and regulations enable certain populations to access childcare, access transportation, access healthcare. And so these rules, these statutes and these rules certainly have a direct impact on our providers' ability to deliver healthcare, our patients' ability to access healthcare, and our patients and our community's ability to access the things that they need in their life. And so if we're not plugged into, if our employees and employers are not plugged into how these decisions around statutes and rules are made, we're certainly giving up some of that control, as Steve said. We've got to be in the game and have a voice in the game.
Right, makes sense. Courtney and and Steve, you're welcome to weigh in on this as well. One of the criticisms of the Civic Secures Democracy Act is that this is yet another example of woke corporations sticking their nose in to social, cultural policy, imposing their views on unsuspecting public. And, that is an argument that some are making about the bill, despite Senator Cornyn's involvement. And Courtney, I wonder if you have an opinion about that, as a large, not-for-profit, but large employer, whether you feel you're possibly stepping out of your lane in supporting people voting or getting involved in civics education.
Well, I just want to,
and I know the answer is no, but I want to ask you anyway.
Well, I want to reiterate that, when we provide information to our employees, it's done in a nonpartisan way, and it's simply information. And we certainly, while we advocate for our communities, our providers, and our patients, it's done with basis of information and merit, and so that's my first response. My second response is that we have a number, we have 13,000 employees that work for our health system, and so there is a diverse, a wide spectrum of different opinions, and all are welcome. And so that's really the hope and the intent of our ECHO, our political determinants ECHO, and of our We Care, We Vote, that we're creating forums where we're allowing for open conversation and open dialogue, questions of our candidates, and so that we can have some of these tough conversations. Because as Steve pointed out, we have to be able to talk about, we have to be able to talk and have questions and have dialogue.
Right. Steve, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I know it's fashionable, particularly in the Republican Party these days, to be calling out corporations for wokeness, whatever that really means. But I'm a conservative Republican, and let me be very clear. I think capitalism is the best economic system that has helped more people rise out of poverty, that's created the opportunity for the less well-off to compete at the voting box and pick their people with the very richest in America. So I want to see capitalism survive. And if we don't teach Americans how capitalism works, and how to participate by participating in civics and electing people who support your view, all these people who are worried about wokeness are going to find that there's more regulation or perhaps a different economic system, whether it's economic socialism or whatever it may be, because the people who might support their view didn't know enough to participate or said that somebody else would do it. So the criticism that this bill is an example of political wokeness is, as we say in the North Country, horse manure. It's not. It's in our best interest. If you are a conservative Republican, or you own a business, or you're trying to start your business, or you hope to start your business, it's important that you have a government system that supports that endeavor. And if I don't want to have a system that isn't capitalism or doesn't line up with my views of how capitalism should work, it's my duty to try and change or shape that system. The only way you can change or shape that system is to know how to work in a civic engagement way, whether it's voting and beyond, participating. So it's a fake criticism. It's a socially convenient code word criticism, and it's complete baloney.
Okay.
The only other thing I would add to your point, Steve, is that we've seen in New Hampshire, particularly in the last couple of sessions, that when we work across party lines, that's the only way we're able to effectively push things to the finish line. And we're not able to do that unless we can find some alignment in values. And so if we continue to see this tension, we've got to be able to work with stakeholders across the table. There were a number of bills this past legislative session that we opposed as the healthcare community, and we wouldn't have been able to effectively oppose some of these policy initiatives without the voices of the business community. And that's the only way we were able to get, in short, some of the bad bills didn't make it to the governor's desk.
Right.
And one of the things I'll just add as a postscript, one of the great things about learning civic education while you're in school is that if it's done right, you learn you can stand by your principles, you can be an advocate for your principles, but you can also realize that the person who has a different view isn't your enemy. Right. Ronald Reagan used to say the person who agrees with you 70% of the time is your friend and your ally, not your enemy. I think in politics, in both parties separately, and certainly as they interact with each other, there's the view that if you don't agree with somebody 100% of the time, they're bad and you're good. Part of a good civics education teaches you that trying to find common ground has been the epitome of democracy and successful democracy in the United States for over 200 years. And we need to teach people how to do that again, because so much of media reinforcement is the exact opposite, because conflict sells more ratings, which makes more money.
Right. So I think Courtney and Steve have both given us a really good sense of the business case for why civics education is valuable. And with that, let me turn to Martha Madsen. And Martha, if you could give us an overview of what is currently being taught in New Hampshire about civics education. I know, it's fairly disaggregated and decentralized, but give us a better understanding of the current state of civics education, if you would.
Absolutely. I just want to also thank you so much for hosting this and focusing on this topic. When I first began this work in 2013, I was knocking on people's doors and everyone thought it was a really old-fashioned, quirky topic to talk about. So I just so appreciate that the business community and other groups like in healthcare are so concerned. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. So yes, in New Hampshire, civics is taught in an uneven way because we have such local control, and we have a very diverse very diverse school districts with different kinds of resources, right? And also because we have local control, and so it's taught in an uneven way. There are some things required. It's required to take a half year, a standalone civics course in high school, which is a good thing. We don't think it's enough, and we think it's too late to begin, but it's something. There is a new law that requires for graduation to pass a naturalization test. I believe it's 70% is considered passing in order to graduate. Again, that's a beginning. It's a focus on knowledge and facts, which certainly are important. But as Steve was saying, civics is a very big set of skills, a body of knowledge and dispositions, right? It's about how do we find common ground? How do we work together to solve these really major problems we're facing? So, so in other words, those two things are a start, but not nearly enough. There has been some...
And Martha, let me just ask, so you said in high school, so in what grade? I may have missed that, but what grade does that begin?
I believe it's usually in sometime between 9th and 12th grade.
Okay.
Yes, I think it's after 8th grade. Although actually, I think it may be 8 through 12, because I know I have a colleague who teaches it in 8th grade. So it's required in most schools. I believe they defer it until the senior year because of voting registration, right? Which makes sense in a way. But when you think about where seniors' heads are, they're kind of halfway out the door at that point, right? I know for my own kids, senior year wasn't a great time, and I think 8th grade is actually a better time if you only have one chance at it. Developmentally, it's just a better time. Kids are more idealistic at that point. They're willing to make a speech about something they care about. It's harder, sometimes for some high school kids to do that.
And does it vary dramatically across town to town, the quality and focus of what's being taught?
Yes, absolutely. There are some towns that have many after school programs, right? Extracurriculars, AP courses in government, and other towns that have almost nothing for that, regarding that. We know that learning lasts when it's experiential. So a program like Youth in Government, those kids are never, ever going to forget what they learned, right? When they do this immersive experience, most young people don't get to do that. And so we know that it's great to understand and remember facts, but we know that after a test, a few days after a test, we tend to forget all the facts, right? And what do we remember? We remember things we did physically, we did socially, right? So we did a mock trial, or we did a project, and we did a service project, and we gathered food for a food pantry, something like that. We remember. When we're adults, even we remember those experiences. So we know that it's uneven. Certainly, we also know that at the state level, civics has not been a priority, and social studies has not been a priority, and that our state standards are antiquated. They're from 2006. And as you said earlier, the federal government has not invested a lot. So, so that's where we are as a state.
And is there pending legislation in 23 that would expand civics education? And do you see some momentum building now?
There's some momentum building now. New Hampshire Civics is leading a coalition called the New Hampshire Civic Learning Coalition. And we are putting together some policies that we have consensus around, which is a pretty hard thing to do. But we've done civics with Civic, for civics, and we are moving in the direction. I can't say exactly when it's going to happen, but we believe that we need more time on civics. We need it to be taught every year, starting in kindergarten in some way, right? We need another half year in middle school in addition to the half year in high school. Developmentally, it doesn't make sense to do it all at once in high school. We really need more professional development. We need to teach kindergarten teachers, just like we taught them how to teach coding, right? Kindergarten teachers are now teaching kindergartners coding. So we can teach them how to integrate civics into what they're already doing with literacy, with their classroom management. And about media literacy as well, like what Steve was saying about reading different points of view, understanding that you need to understand your sources, when you're gaining information, and that you don't only read what you already agree with. So,
right. What are some of the outcomes that you can, positive benefits and positive outcomes that you've seen? And I know Carisa can probably add to this, but anything, Martha, that you'd cite as a best practice in the state that you would want to see replicated?
Wow, there are so many, and they're all different. For example, Hanover High School has what's called the council. And this council's been around since the 70s. It's not just, the kind of student council that you imagine. This council made up of students has real power, but again, it's one of the branches. It doesn't have all the power, but they all understand Robert's rules. So in that way, right, that is a great example. We know Pittsfield has a similar kind of authentic power built into their student government. Sauhegan does as well. I think, that the schools that integrate democracy into their authentic decision-making, that's a really important model. There are other schools that do other things really well. But in terms of outcomes, I would like to see equitable opportunities for all students and for them to have those authentic experiences, not just memorizing facts, but experiencing democracy at its best, right? Being able to measure learning outcomes. We don't have any measures right now for civics. That's something that this federal legislation encourages. And I think assessments that are not just multiple choice, but assessments that are performance-based, right? Mm-hmm. That's the way we do things in New Hampshire. We have competencies. So that, or portfolios that demonstrate growth. And we need state standards too that align with our national standards in some way. And ultimately, we want New Hampshire residents who can deliberate, they can compromise, they can listen, they can have a civil discussion, and they can work together to find common ground and solve problems.
Great. Thank you. Chris, I know you have probably a number of perspectives to add to what Martha just said. So let me first ask, there are different definitions of civics education, right? So what is a working definition that you use, as an educator, and what is a perspective that we might want to think about from, why civics education matters to business?
So I think we've got so many of our young people who are enrolled in public education, and they will be serving our communities through business and nonprofits. And so that's why it matters, because they need to be able to advocate for themselves and others, to be able to understand the system that they're in so that they can make changes and work for good. I think an interesting thing to think about is literacy, and this concept of literacy. What does it mean? And so I always think of my dad, who was illiterate until he was about 24 years old. And he could recognize letters, right? He could say what an A, a B, a C is, but the literacy part is really applying that skill of putting words together. And so when we think about civics education, we really need to think about civics literacy and applying the skills. And so it's almost building on what Martha said, but we can't ask folks to just memorize for a test, because that does not stick. And that does not show kids how to act in democracy. Public school is a really great opportunity for our kids to come from different perspectives and learn and practice what it means to live in a representative democracy. And so I think about that, just how you set up your school. So Martha described student senates or student faculty senates. That's a great opportunity to practice civic literacy and build that civic literacy. Also, students should be encouraged through extended learning opportunities to participate in nonprofit boards or to just like learn about their communities by attending public meetings. And so when we think about what's offered in schools, which is in high school, it's a half a credit, it's required, that's the minimum. But there are so many other opportunities that we can explore and to like think about like how we understand that. My main worry in this legislation and all legislation related to curriculum and instruction is the assessment piece. That's really my wheelhouse is assessment. I'm not a fan of the newest civics bill, which requires students to memorize for this citizen test, because doesn't prove that they're a good citizen, right? It proves they can memorize for something. And so we need to be very, very careful. When we put money into something, folks want accountability. They want to know that their money worked for something. So we need to seek to, I don't think measure civics literacy. I think we need to seek to understand, and we need to have some deep conversations. Like, what does it look like for a New Hampshire citizen to be a good citizen? And so does that mean volunteering? Does that mean serving on boards? Does that mean going to vote? Does that mean running for office? So I think that we need to, as a community, as a whole state, actually have this conversation. What does civics actually mean? And then we can sort of move forward in, okay, how do we know?
Right. You know, just on that point of defining civics education, I know that in Indiana, the Indiana Bar Foundation has completed several years of a civics index, and with a set of criteria evaluating how knowledgeable the public is about any number of variables about government and public service and what the libraries do. And so, you know, maybe there's a similar project in New Hampshire that could get to your point of defining, you know, what success looks like. Does that sound useful from your perspective?
Yeah, I think we need to define that, what it looks like, and then how we're going to understand that. That's not through a standardized test. I mean, right. 70% on a multiple guess test, I don't think is good enough. I consider my own public education in New Hampshire, which was really a pretty good education, but I didn't learn about how our state government worked until I stopped being a teacher and actually had the time to learn how a bill becomes a law. Now, I learned that in high school, basically, to go through, but it's so intricate and it's really complicated. It's not as easy as this one, progression, because there's a lot of players and a lot of things to talk about and strategize, which is a skill that's part of civics literacy, I think. And so I think we need to just, take a step back and really ask those questions, like, what does it look like? What are our hopes? And then what does it look like? What are we going to accept as the story of civics literacy in New Hampshire?
Mm-hmm. And as you think about what Courtney and Steve both offered as far as the business case for civics education, would you say that they are sort of on the leading edge of this, or is the work you and Martha are doing being more widely accepted by businesses across the state?
I think everyone has to work together. I mean, Courtney talked about this, that like all the sectors connect. Like we cannot just live on islands. Public schools, all education, right? We're preparing the next community. That's what's happening here. And so when we think about just civics education by itself and not connected to the different sectors, healthcare, owning your own business, science, everything is so tightly connected to civics. And so we cannot chop it up. I think that's one of my criticisms of how our public schools are organized, is that we do chop things up into civics and math and science and English. All of those should be together collectively, because you can't separate those things out. So when we can see that the science education is important and my civics literacy is important, because if I want to have healthy air to breathe, I have to know how to go and fight for that. I can't just know the scientific facts about how trees work or that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Richard, if I could just add, Carissa, I think your analogy to a holistic solution is really important. And that's one of the pieces that we were talking about in our political determinants of health echo, because we know that people wear so many different hats, right? They're business leaders, they're parents, they're teachers, their adult children to aging loved ones, their board members on our local nonprofits. And one of the hopes of our political determinants of health echoes was to talk to our providers and our employees and other professionals across the state about how to and when to plug in. We know that time is, none of us have enough time, and learning what outlets to plug into and how to access the resources. It
Right.
might be impossible for some of our business leaders to come to Concord and testify on a bill with 3 days notice, because that's how much notice a bill hearing is, that's how much notice we have. But it might be more possible to plug into a trade association or to a government relations office to say, hey, when this bill does come up for a hearing, can you please submit this written testimony? And so that was really one of our efforts, was how to learn the advocacy ecosystem and just identify which areas a person or professional can plug into.
Right. I think that's a really important point about understanding the ecosystem where you as an individual or you as a business leader or a parent fit in, and where you can conceivably have the most leverage. Michelle, do we have any questions?
Dina, can you share the questions that we've been receiving?
Yes, we have a few questions. The first one from Nancy. Research shows us that historically representation and civic engagement from elected officials to who shows up at public meetings is not a true representation of our communities. What does the panel have to say about the need for more equity in civic participation so all voices are heard?
Well, I'll just weigh in on that a little bit. I understand the complaint that it's not fair if you don't show up and you don't get a voice, but the foundation of how our system works, which I think is the best one man has invented so far, is that you vote. I am very intolerant of people who don't make an effort to vote, and I understand how busy people are, and they've got work lives and they've got odd hours. But if in New Hampshire, if you can't be present to vote because your work prohibits you or you're going to be out of the state, it's pretty easy to absentee vote, or frankly, a lot of businesses are now giving people time off to go vote. But you're right. People who are generally on the lower end of the economic spectrum usually have less participation because they have less opportunity to vote because of their job. And I think over time, enlightened businesses will give people incentives and or time off to participate.
And it sounded as though the question also related maybe to steps before voting, Steve. So, Courtney, I wonder if I could turn to you for a moment. And, the educational programs you're running at Dartmouth, have you done any sort of civics education work that educates folks about, here's how the town council works, or here's how the school board works? Are you at that granular level prior to encouraging them to actually go vote?
So I always have a running list of things to do, Richard. So thanks for adding a couple more on there.
Okay.
What we do have on our intranet page is an internal page at Dartmouth. We have some resources on how to plug in to the New Hampshire legislative process. And so if you want to testify on a bill, we have some tools to do that. But to Steve's point, that's exactly what our We Care, We Vote initiative is hoping to do, is educate people on how to register to vote, how to access an absentee ballot. That was really important in the 2020 election cycle, of course, because our COVID numbers were really high. And so absentee ballots were really important. But as Steve pointed out, it is attainable in New Hampshire to access an absentee ballot. And our voting registration pages, which are no more than 2 pages long, help our employees walk through that process of how to access that. And then as Steve pointed out, just really educating our employees on the candidates, what are their platforms, where do they stand, and providing them an opportunity to ask questions of the candidates in a virtual way.
Okay.
Can I just add there that the voting is just one aspect of civic literacy, and just voting in September or November, those are just 2 days. And so when I think about my local school district, which is a regional school district, and our annual meeting, you have to show up to vote. You have to show up to vote on that budget. And so if I'm a poor person who has a job or 2 or 3 just to survive in New Hampshire because I don't make a living wage, I can't show up to vote because in those types of meetings, because I'm excluded in that way. Or I don't have time if I'm working 1 or 2 jobs in order to serve my school board, which is another piece of civic literacy, or to even connect with my school board. So I think it's like a bigger conversation than just showing up to vote in September and November or those other days, especially in New Hampshire with our annual meetings.
Right. And let me, because we just have a few more minutes, unfortunately, but let me build on that comment by Carisa. And, this is something I think that's really relevant to all businesses. And the question is, given that there's a direct correlation between socioeconomic and civic engagement, meaning the better off one is economically, the more engaged they likely are in civics. So what is it that the panelists would recommend that individual companies can do to kind of bridge this gap? We know we want to encourage everyone to vote and participate, as Steve reminded us. And as Carisa said, there are, some intermediate initial steps that we need to do. So, Steve, would you like to offer any thoughts on, just quickly on sort of things that you can do in your own workplace that would encourage people to learn about civics?
Well, we tend to do a lot of contests, so I can see I have a little bit of a different view. I do think there are some hard facts that one needs to know about how democracy functions that are facts that you shouldn't have to Google. So I don't find these citizen tests all that offensive. There's a base of knowledge that we shouldn't have, so I think we do lots of quizzes and fun events like that to teach people. We give people incentives to go vote. And I understand that if you're working 2 jobs and you're a single parent, you have a very hard time saying, I'm going to go volunteer to be on a school board committee. Until somebody has a better solution, I think involvement is the core aspect of civic life. I think New Hampshire's made great strides during the pandemic. Some good news. There are a lot of meetings that are by Zoom. You can participate remotely, particularly on local school boards. Here in Concord, we have our zoning discussion going on by Zoom and remotely. So I think that's been one little plus. But I think it's going to take a lot more effort by a lot of businesses to create incentives for people to have a fair opportunity to vote. If we just did that, I think people would feel better about the democracy, even if they don't have their own time at any point in their life. I'm not sure structurally we can ever overcome or do anything. We're not going to go to weighted voting. If you're lower on the economic scale, you get more votes. So there always are going to be some disadvantages. But I think businesses need to step up and do more, whether it's on education programs like you at Dartmouth, forums, entertaining candidates, incentives to go vote, things like that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve. Martha,
we have a question from Jim Shatner, the CEO of NHBR, and he says, as we strive towards mandating more civic education, how can we be working together to engage youth and adults in informal civics education? So NHBR is not the only organization in the state that's working in this arena. There are multiple, as we just heard. How can they work together?
That's one for Martha to talk about the coalition.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about our work with the coalition. We have about 45 stakeholders. We've been meeting up for a year now. We've identified our top areas that we want to focus on. Equity, I think it's just super important, right? That's sort of how you begin a more even playing field for people. So more equity, student voice, very important to practice that civic knowledge and civic skills and dispositions. Also more time on civics. We need more time. I mean, that we can't compromise on that anymore. And we need better, as I said, professional development for teachers. And so those are the things that we're working on. We're going into our 2nd year. Yeah, I welcome any questions about that, or if people are interested in participating.
Great. Michelle, I know we're at time, so let me turn it back to you and see, do we have a few more minutes or should we end here?
I think given everyone's busy schedules, I think we probably should wrap, but maybe if everybody can just give a super quick, any last thoughts that you have, that would be great. And then we'll wrap this up.
Great. Carisa, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think that these questions are really great, and we should actually take the time to answer them in maybe a different format, even if it's written. So I really appreciate the conversation. I think that we demonstrated, I am not necessarily in agreement with some of the folks on the panel about how our system works or doesn't work. And so I think this is like the purpose, the point, right? Like to have conversation with people who don't agree about how we should move forward, because that is civics literacy. So I appreciate this time. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Martha?
Hi, I just want to piggyback on what Carisa said earlier about science, right? If you know all about how to clean the air, but you don't know how to advocate for that, right? And to make that available for you and for everyone in your community, that's a problem. You can know things and not know how to use that, use it for the common good, or even to advocate for individual rights. And as Ken Burns has said, civics is the glue, right? It's what connects us. It connects all the different disciplines, and it connects all of us. It's how we solve problems together, whether it has to do with science or something else. But anyway, thank you very much for this. It's a very important conversation.
Good. Martha, thank you. Steve, your final thoughts.
We're one of the largest employers of new Americans, resettled refugees from war-torn countries. And we help a lot of them and support them in their effort to become United States citizens. And it is truly amazing to me how much more the average refugee who passes the citizenship test knows about how our civic government works, how government works, and how to participate than a lot of our native-born population. And I can assure you, those people never miss an election, no matter what other burdens we have. I have one woman from Somalia with 12 children, and she became an American citizen, and I hazard a guess that if she had to crawl to the voting place, she would do so, having come from a world where this was so foreign. I think we Americans are not nearly as appreciative of the rights we have, and it's incumbent on businesses and teachers to pass on that incredible value and say to folks, let's find common ground on tough issues.
Thank you. Well said, Steve. And Courtney, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here today, because we have our audience, looking across the audience, is a diverse set of different sectors of business leaders. And so thank you for taking the time to really think about how you can support your employees and your community to be better plugged in. We all have capacity challenges, right? I'm sure many of us are signed up to do a lot of different things, but really grateful for your time today and your willingness to think about your strengths, to think about what interests you have, think about how to play to your strengths, whether it's sitting on a nonprofit board or finding a trade association that you care about, and just think about how to better build our community. Because I think if we can find one way to plug in and be more civically engaged, we're going to better New Hampshire.
Great, good. Well, thank you all. Michelle and Xenia, thanks so much for hosting this. I'll turn it back to you in a second, Michelle, but just as a reminder, Business for America does have this business sign-on letter directed to members of Congress calling for the enactment of the Civic Secures Democracy Act. If you'd like to sign that, we'll make sure you get a copy of the letter or a link to that. And then, we're happy to stay involved and support the effort in New Hampshire. And if there's enough interest, we hope to then set up a meeting with your two senators so businesses can actually make the case to Senator Hassan and Senator Shaheen about getting on board to support this. So thank you. And Michelle, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, I want to thank our panelists. What wonderful information you've shared with us today. And I also want to just remind everyone that this is a series that we're actually doing, back to school webinars. So we have one coming up on September 28th towards strong public education in New Hampshire. And once again, we've got a very diverse panel. We like to have these conversations where we're getting information from the experts, and whether it's agreed or not, we like to have the conversations. And so we are very appreciative of today and are hoping that you'll join us for this next webinar on September 28th. So thank you all very much for your participation, and thanks to our panelists. I think you'll all agree they've been wonderful.
Great. Good. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.